So this one, I'm going to be upfront with you. It is a real risk.
Okay.
There was a building that burned down. That is the risk that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
But the frisking comes into what did they do about the reinsurance? Because basically in this scenario, very famous legal case, I say very famous, apparently it's in one of the top 50 reinsurance case law examples of all time.
That's as famous as we get sometimes.
Exactly, which I expect everyone universally to be very deeply familiar with. But basically, in this particular case, there was a $7 million limit available for the insurer to claim with its reinsurers, and in the process of the insurer working out whether they were going to pay the claim in the first place with the client, there was heavy litigation because there was suspected arson that led to this $43 million building burning down. And the cost of that litigation spiraled and became really, really expensive. And they had this huge debate about whether loss adjusting expenses, which in this case amounted to $5 million, were included in the reinsurer's limit or whether they were additional to that as well. So the insurance company basically sent the reinsurer a bill once this was settled, and it was settled that the insurer had to pay the claim. And they said, well, it's $12 million, please, because the limit's for the $7 million. Yep. Plus we've got $5 million of loss adjusting expenses. And this bounced back and forwards between the courts. So the lower courts, first one said, yeah, absolutely. The second one said, no, hang on, that shouldn't be included. How did it end up is my Frisk Risk challenge. What did they ultimately decide?
Oh, these are getting much more tricky, which is good. This is super interesting because when you look at how reinsurance contracts are written, a lot of these things are not as clearly defined in a way that makes like it very black and white. Because you'd think that, well, whatever the contract said, it would say this is or is not included. But so oftentimes, like the nuance of this industry is the spectrum of gray areas that we work in. I'm going to hedge my guess on Frisk Risk and say they settled parts of LAE. So they didn't get the 12, but they got more than the 7, is my guess. They agreed to meet in the middle and give them $2.5 million of loss adjusted expense cover instead of.
It's a good guess. Unfortunately, it's not the correct one. But I liked your way of thinking about it and avoiding being completely wrong.
Yeah,
but you're partly wrong.
What? How did it work?
So what actually ended up happening?
What's the building, by the way?
I can't remember.
Okay.
It was some big building that caught fire. Not a particularly significant one.
Fine.
But yeah, basically, in the end, they had to decide that it was $5 million in this case, of much bigger than expected loss adjustment expenses. But if they set the precedent that loss adjusting expenses would be included in the limit at that point, that would not be included in the limit and could just be added on top, then that would imply that the parties had intended on creating the contract that the reinsurer would be liable for potentially unlimited cover for loss adjustment expenses. And they decided that surely the parties could not have intended or premeditated that the reinsurer would pay above the limit any loss adjustment expenses, no matter how large.
Yeah.
So they successfully won the case on that basis and limited their reinsurance payout to just the $7 million for the actual claim.
Yeah.
And no further costs beyond that.
So
the limit had to include the loss adjusted expenses as well, at least in that case. So.
Which leaves the insurer with essentially $2 million in overall return because they spent their $5 on lawyers.